Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Okay, I have to say this now again. Welcome to the Stoa. It's a place for dialogue around what matters most at the knife's edge of the moment. I was talking to Peter a little bit earlier. Yeah, now you know why I'm not a weather person. I was talking to Peter earlier about the design of this because we, in a sense, it's supposed to be like one-offs, but there is a sense that we're building on things. And when you build on things, you know, you don't want to be in a situation where people get lost in what you're doing. Yeah. Does anybody have? I'm just gonna talk for a couple more minutes around this while I'm letting people in. Does anyone have a kind of energy or impulse of where you'd like to go today, if you've been here for a couple of times, or or what this could be for you today, just to help me organize amongst the potentials that we might do. Does anyone have any questions you're holding from the, like, what the hell are we doing here, or need some clarification?
I've never been here on this, but I'm enjoying this picture behind you, and like the way the light is kind of reflecting off it, and the kind of shapes that are forming out of that, and I'm finding it kind of yeah, I'm feeling excited, like playful.
Yeah, so I got that for my birthday this year in April, and the artist is Jenny Baird. And, you know, I put it intentionally there because I think it really speaks to me. It speaks to like how I'm trying to hold this space. Yeah, so thank you for noticing it. Jenny Baird, B-A-I-R-D, just fabulous stuff in her gallery. So. Okay, so what have we been doing? We started with deep code. What we're trying to do is, as clearly and simply as possible, understand ourselves, the way we make meaning, the way we make sense making. We started with deep code, which kind of unpacked these large concepts such as power and trust. So that was one way to take complexity and kind of get a handle, wrap some conversation around it. And then we started doing actually some interior work, some phenomenology, and asking ourselves what's under the hood, like how does this work? So we worked with inner talk, and we looked carefully at what inner talk, how inner talk is composed. What is it composed of? And this consideration we got to was that inner talk is actually sub-threshold micro actions of talk. That when that happens, when I say water, and if I have a sub-threshold action, little bit of action, electricity, that pattern in my jaw and my mouth and my tongue, the perceptual function of my brain anticipates that it comes with this sound, water. So it completes it down retroactively. Someone said it's like burning a CD. It completes the other side. So we likened it to burning a CD. We also likened it to this notion of, well, what burns inner talk? And we talked about, well, if I close my eyes and I imagine raising my right hand, right? Okay, I can recreate that in my imagination. And what's the foundational experience that enables me to recreate that? It's raising my right hand. So the same thing, the foundational experience that primes the organism for inner talk is actual talk and actual speech. We also made a analogy about phantom limb syndrome, right? Because certain intentions always come with a certain feeling, then if I have my limb severed, I can in fact have the feeling that I'm moving my arm, because these things, what we call co-vary. So your whole life, there's certain things that almost 100% you can expect something almost 100% coming from those things. So when I say water, I can expect that sound water coming from those things. If I say water, I can expect the duh coming from the feeling of my tongue doing that. And this is how we teach, or I don't teach, but people can teach people who are deaf to speak, because you investigate with your hands what the mouth is doing, and you do that, the mouth and the breath. And even though they can't hear themselves, they can speak. And this is also why when we start to lose our hearing, we can read lips, because of these mirror neurons. So this is also part of why people can read minds. So you can do an experiment where, let's say I give someone a card and it has the word water, sky, and ambulance. Okay, so those are quite different in terms of their sounds. And and the person has a card and picks one of those cards. So let's say it's ambulance. And I ask them to say the word in their head without moving their mouth. And then I ask them to spell it in their head without moving their mouths. And I have someone watching them. I'll get a better than 30% predictability that the person can tell what word is in the person's head. Because very, very subtly, there are mirror neurons, and you're subconsciously picking up on very subtle cues in the context, right? So this is like a game that some people play. You know, you hear Dan Brown and people say, you know, my guru, my mentor, he could read my mind. Part of it is picking up on these subtle cues, but also understanding that there's quite a lot of patterns that compose people. And a meditation teacher understands not only there are patterns, but there's certain stages that people are in, so they can guess pretty well what kind of package you're in. So we're just trying to play around with touching base on some of these. So what would be a next step? What would be a next step to investigating what's under the hood? Let's talk about emotions. And let's try to get a handle on what the literature on emotions is messy. So you have emotions, you have the word feelings. And in the literature, unfortunately, some people use the word feelings in a certain way and emotions in another way, and other authors use it in the opposite way. So like Damasio and I think Pansket use them the other way. So first of all, if you're reading the literature, this is maybe why you're confused. So just to make sure that you understand when you're reading the literature, which way is the author using this, and if it's transposed from another author, then in your mind, to compare the two, you have to do that semantic mapping. But for our purposes, then, we are going to agree on defining these things in a specific way. So we're going to use the word feeling as bodily sensation. I feel hot. I feel Yeah, I feel hot. I feel like I'm gonna get a stomach ache. I feel butterflies in my stomach. I feel how this is soft. See, everything is really more in terms of bodily sensation. So that's how we're going to use the term feeling. And then we're going to use this term affect. And affect, yeah, okay, yeah, very close. So affects, we're going to say, is more subtle than feelings. And we're not going to get into this today, but in my work, I map it onto Jack Panksepp's there's 7 affect streams. And Gene Russell showed that they come in pairs. So there's 3 pairs of affect streams and then another one. So what we mean by affects are this: something changes in my body. Okay, the word feeling means I can feel something in my body. I'm conscious of it, okay? Affect is whether I'm aware of it or not. So my heart rate might go up or down. It could be so subtle, I can't be aware of it, tiny little murmurations. My adrenaline levels, all the neural cocktails are constantly changing. My vagus nerves constantly processing information. My pupils may dilate or contract. Some nerves become tense, others become relaxed. So that's what we're going to call affect. It's this kind of interior homostatic or responsive mode or state of intention, how my body is primed in any given moment, right? So they're different than feelings because I'm not necessarily aware of them. I can train myself to be more sensitive to them, but an affect is that. And Panksepp uses this notion of affect because the way it works in our body is consistent with all mammals. Okay, so that's feeling, affect, and now emotions. So I'm going to say an emotion is an affect plus a story. Okay, so we talked about the stories like some kind of mental model. We talked about which the energy comes up and then it reproduces a mental model of some kind of, and the mental model can become a story in your head. Yeah. So an emotion is an affect plus a story. Now let me give you an example of what I mean. We know in early childhood, when a child falls down, right? A child will fall down and their body affects will change. Their adrenaline will go up. They might have a startle response, right? This is very easy. But they turn to their primary caregiver to figure out what affective tone to put that in, to put that with. It's just at first, just something that's happening in their body. They turn to who's ever taking care of them and they look for a marker. And if you fall down and bump your knee and your mother is scared, then you're going to couple this notion of threat to those kinds of bodily sensations. If your mother goes, oh, let's see, are you all right? Then you will couple that with curiosity. So this is, and then the curiosity becomes stories or the threat becomes stories. But the actual body sensation is neutral to a story. The affect is neutral to the story in those ways. So let me give you another example. And this is where I wish Panksepp hadn't used these words. One of our primary affect streams he calls fear. Now, when he investigates that, certain things happen. Your adrenaline levels go up, your parasympathetic and your neurosympathetic and your vagus nerves, your pupils open up, Some muscles contract, some relax. This is exactly what happens to a deer when it's in the woods and it hears something. But for the deer, it primes them for action. They're not sitting there like shuddering, oh my God, like we think they are. We project that onto them. So the very same kind of neurochemical, electrochemical, affect-laden body response is in the deer, who's primed to run, in a sense, in their power, and in you. But then when you add your story of threat or worry, it becomes fear in the human sense. And this is why when you're working with people, you, as coaches, you want to turn to what is actually your body doing. Try to move from the story. Now, just like we have downward causation in inner talk and phantom limb, eventually the story can downwardly cause the body to change its affect configuration. Now you're fucked. Now you're really fucked. So this is why what we want to really try to do is try to get rid of, out of the habit of the story. Affects, like everything else in the universe, they come and they go, and they take the time they take. Some of you may have noticed, especially, I mean, I'm going to make this, it's kind of hyper, this is kind of stereotypical, but, you know, when you, it'd be interesting. I'd be interested in a male version of the same story, but when you're a young woman and you have your menstrual cycle, you noticed how your affects are changing, and you learn not to interpret the world from the fact that you have a threat response all the time. When I had my hysterectomy, I got very agoraphobic. It was like, oh my God, it was going to rain when these people were coming on the weekend, and I was sitting there in bed going like, what if it rains? And all this threat response would come. And it was just because my hormones were all messed up. And so, you know, you learn, if you have erratic hormones at certain times, that the stories that are served up, it's so obviously out of sync with the reality. It's an opportunity to learn how to be with the affects and not import or impute the story that may or may not be relevant or accurate to the actual occasion onto that. Is there a male, something analogous? Okay, so moving on, Jean Russell, I think that's her name. Her last name is Russell. I don't think it might be Diane Russell. She's a student of Jack Panskep, and she said, so Panskep says there's fear, care, panic, anger, fear, care, panic, anger,
rage and play.
Rage and play, thank you. No, not seeking and play.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. And these are common, like he talks a lot about seeking and play and can be argued to be more fundamental in the animal nature, you know, like, you know, why the cat is curious. He could have everything he wants at home, but this seeking, this movement is very fundamental to animal nature. It's very primordial. It separates the plants from the animals, the fact that we seek and move. Okay. So this woman, Russell, I think it's Diane Russell, she noticed something interesting. She noticed that the seeking and the fear had the same quality of energy, but one was more expanded than the other. And she called these the tremulous energies. You know, when we're seeking for something, if we're you know, these not sci-fi, these horror movies where the woman is going to like open the door and she hears all this horrible stuff on the other side of the door, and you're like, no, don't open the door. And then she opens the door and, you know, she gets eaten by the aliens or something. This is a good portal to understand her notion of seeking. She calls it tremulous energies. When you're seeking something, it has this notion of excitement that's like fear. And then she says, and then when you're contracted, and studies are now, she's looking for studies that show the seeking and the fear have to do with vagal tone, because right at the edge of seeking, there's a boundary between seeking and fear. So when you're looking for something, and so as a coach, what I work with is when I see, if I'm working with fear, you move it, you say it's in the same direction as seeking. So you always move fear to curiosity. Well, let's take a look. Maybe that's not the case. Do we really understand what the government is saying? Do we really believe this conspiracy theory? We always take fear and move it toward curiosity or seeking. There's the same relationship between care and panic. Panic is the experience of losing someone or something you care for. So the child's panic at separation anxiety, right? And we know this is very close. When you have your first crush, you really care for the person and you're like on the phone like 24 hours a day to make sure you're not going to lose them, right? So this notion between panic, care and panic, this is a great exercise if you're like me and you take care of orphaned wild animals, because you care for them and then you have to let them be wild animals and you're so afraid that they're gonna be eaten, you know? So she talks about how she calls care and panic the connection energies. They're the connection energies. And so what's interesting is, again, as a coach, instead of moving people around, if they're panicked about, you know, being abandoned or separation, you lead them to where that shows them that they really care, about something, because it's in the same stream. Does that make sense? We're going to get to rage, I know. We want to do that one too. And then play and anger, the same thing. It's like watching I used to have these two big Marima sheepdogs. They guard sheep and they're very territorial, and they would play. They would play and they'd play, and the older one had a bad back. And as soon as she got hurt, she just like, the play turned into anger. So there's something very close between anger and play. The contracted form of play is anger. So there's that, so there again, so when someone's angry, you try to move that toward play. And we see this all the time in the martial arts and sports, that boundary, right? Between, my sister and I, we used to play this game where we would take brushes, this is when we were kids, not recently, and we would hit each other on the leg. And it would be playful with a little bit of bite, you know? And then all of a sudden it would turn and you would get angry, right? So this notion between play and angry is about boundaries. So anger is the contracted form of play. So you can work with them as 3 affect streams. And of course, what moves them into contracted forms is often a story, right? So you're playing and you're very playful with someone, and then your energy or your capacity turns into a contracted form, and then you're like, he was aggressive, or he was mean, or it's his fault. And you start justifying that switch with these stories, instead of just understanding that there's this toggle at the edge of how much energy, these energy signatures. And we all have to work, we all have instances of working on this consciously, like when you're a mother and your child is starting to grow up, you're constantly toggling that, right? You want to care for them and support that, but you can feel your panic. You don't want them to get their first driver's license. You don't want them to take the car. And you know that it's not good to keep falling into the contracted form, and they're very, very close. Well, that's interesting. Okay, so now there's an even more contracted form in each one of these situations. So seeking is the tremulous energies. The contracted form is fear, but then there's dread. And dread is these very contracted low energy states. Well, I wouldn't say low energy states. They're very boxed in. Dread is a very boxed in state. You can't, it's very hard to work with them because the energy's bounded up. But that would be the pathological state. In terms of the connection energies, care is the expanded form, panic is the contracted form, and grief is the very serious form. Yeah, care and panic. Okay, these are the words that Jack Pansep used. Panic is merely the experience of losing something you care for, right? So maybe panic is too severe a reaction, but it's this notion of fear of losing something you care for. So if you have, yeah, that's why it's called the panic grief system, because grief is the loss, truly the loss of something you love, right? So you like lose a child, like they die. This is grief. So it moves the needle into this more serious contraction. And then play, and Russell calls play and anger the mastery energies. It's how we master. And we know this is true in a lot of martial arts and sports. Play is the expanded form, anger is the contracted form, and rage is the bunched up repressed form, okay, or rejected form. So when we have someone who's quick to anger growing up and you repress that, then they can move that into rage. So you try to move that into play. You try to hook them up with people who can constantly help them master a sport or master an exercise and create that kind of movement toward all this energy in me, you know, like boxing. And these are powerful methodologies, psychotechnologies for that energy signature, if that you have that energy signature. Now, the interesting thing is most people can identify what their energy signature, where their energy signature most lies upon, like what is mostly their signature. Yeah, so yes, just as an aside, the seventh stream in Panskep's affects is lust, and it's an interesting thing. It'd be interesting to see if it follows the same matrix that was set up by Diane Russell, but I'm kind of just trying to give you some established science, let's say. So I'm following that a little bit. I do have a way that I talk about lust, but it's kind of made up. It's not in line with the way it's being used in these methodologies. So, but most people can find where they spend most of their time in. Like, do they spend a lot of, if their energy is free, do they spend a lot of time caring? When they're contracted, they tend toward anxiety and panic. Or are you a seeking person who throws yourself out there, but then that means you take a lot of risk, and so you're always working with risk? And or are you someone who's very playful and needs to play a lot and very sporty, but gets angry a lot and has the potential for rage? So there's many people, maybe not this group, because I work mostly with people who are highly nuanced personalities, but in general, there's an energy signature in most people that tends to spend most of its time in one of those streams. What is the relationship between energy signature and personality? Okay, from a Taoist perspective, they're very, very, very close, because we try not to import too many stories or caricatures or a language around energy signature. We try just to work with the energy signature. It's a very strong, when you can work with at this level with either coaching or in business or in your own life, there's a lot of leverage point. The deeper you can get, it becomes more simple. I mean, I only have like 9 boxes, but it requires a lot more practice and sensitivity and subtle sensing, right? But it's a very powerful, so, and again, in my work, we started this, I think the very first day I explained to you that all my work's about trying to take huge amount of complexity and trying to get at these fundamental leverage points that are simple but powerful ways to make progress, either as a coach or on a spiritual path or in your life or whatever you're trying to do. And I've worked with very complex, I would say, egos, and really I find it very helpful just to keep with the basis. So you'll hear your client or go into all these stories, and you'll feel the temptation to follow them into the story, but basically you're wondering, where are they toggling? Are they toggling between seeking and fear? And how can I then move from the fear to the seeking, or highlight the attractor toward the seeking? So that's all. I don't really care about the story or care about the personality. I'm always just trying to allow the energy to understand that if you have a lot of panic, then you have what it takes to care deeply, right? It's in this, you have the tool already. I don't have to put something else in there. If you have a lot of rage, I see the potential for great mastery in you because I see it in the same direction. So I don't want to repress that. It's energy for free. It's energy that I want to work for. If you Davinlu, what's Habib Davinlu? Some of you might know him. He created a psychotechnology called intensive short-term intensive dynamic theory, or it has to do with intensive and short-term. He worked with a lot of like serial killers and really sociopaths that had a lot of rage. And he showed how energetically the rage has to be expressed before it can move into anger and beyond. So a lot of what we do in schools today is we've been so conditioned that anger is bad, that it should not appear, that it doesn't have a place in public space, that we constantly repress that. And unfortunately, it's so bad, we even repress roughhouse play in public space. And Panskep has proved, his research shows this is part of the schizophrenic nature of children today, and boys are at higher risk. for this. So to me, we can read a whole lot of psychology, a whole lot of theory, but I think that ultimately at the end of the day, you're working with some simple but powerful parts of the human experience that actually map on to our deeper evolutionary potential. Now, we did talk, I think last week, that we're not just animal. There's some kind of correlation between the potential for pro-social relationship that makes our childhood more precarious than an animal, right? We're more, the window of opportunity is longer, but it's more precarious. A child can have an affect tone set in a very problematic way more than an animal, but animals are the same. Someone came to my house just the other day. She was very sad. She adopted this lovely Staffordshire Terrier, Pit Bull Terrier, as a child, as a puppy. It's 7 months old now. It's like this with her. I mean, it's a beautiful relationship, but it's so territorial to this woman that it attacks everything that comes around her. And so they wanted to see if I could work with the dog, and I had to be honest, it was not something that I could work with. And so this is a case of, you know, some of this deep inflexibility in some of these energies. And of course, even an affect tone that's set very early on is subject to quite a lot of flexibility, even as adults. We have a lot of neuroplasticity. Yeah, get Caesar on the case, yeah. Well, that's, you know, it's interesting that, Eric, you said that. It required, we were talking about what kind of person could work with that dog. And it really requires someone of that, again, a certain kind of energy signature. So for me, it was, I have a lovely dog who's not dominant and is a male. I wanted to see if I could socialize her to him, and it wasn't going to happen. So, all right. So now this is the 9 boxes. Now I'm going to map the 9 boxes onto more of a spiritual kind of formulation. How does this relate to spirituality? So we have the tremulous energies, which are seeking, fear, and dread. We have the connection energies, which are care, panic, and grief. And we have the mastery energies, which are play, anger, and rage. And then, you know, I think I'll add at some point, then we have the tantric energies. I found a place for lust in my matrix. So yeah, so that's cool. Thanks for, they have to go somewhere, and we do talk about it, but I hadn't really set it out in my matrix here. Okay, so then we have the tantric energies. I believe, so what I think lust is, I just might as well answer it. I'm going to call it the tantric energies. They are all those other things trying to be reflected onto another. So they intensify, right? So microcosmic orbit between people. So care, I can microcosmically orbit care with you and the connection and build this notion of connection. Mastery, same thing. There's a kind of lustfulness and kind of like, what are the 2 tennis players? Nick Dvorak and the other guy. There's a bromance happening there. So I think lust is something that's applied to all of those. It's a context, a new context for all of those to play in a certain way. But that's just my story. This is not part of any established. Truth. Okay, so we call them the tantric energies. Now, I think there are spiritual forms of these affect streams. So, for example, the tremulous energies, seeking, fear, and dread, that maps really well onto the spiritual or mystical experience of awe in the face of mystery. I say you become the perfect seeker. You have all this seeking energy, but you realize it becomes infinite curiosity and this sense of awe. And those are the tremulous energies. And you hear in the mystic experience that there's always like the trembling in the face of God, like they're in that same direction. So again, you can work with the same kind of fundamental, awe is in our animal nature, in the human, push to the human form. So in terms of connection, that has something to do with, like, I hate the word unity, because it's conceptually like hierarchical, but this notion of experience oneself as interbeing. And you realize that you care for everything, but nothing ever is lost and nothing is ever gained. There's no panic associated with this notion of interbeing, of complete participation, the interweb of everything. Changes the nature of the care panic. It becomes a mystical experience of that affect stream. And then in terms of the mastery stream, the play, anger, and rage, I don't have a good word for this, but it's something like Wu Wei, the spontaneous, alive, skillful action. It's unencumbered. It's what you get. This stream is what you discover in the martial arts.
That flow, you would say?
Flow could be.
Spontaneity.
Pardon?
Spontaneity. Spontaneous response.
Yeah, spontaneous is in it. Flow is in it. Has to do with like a mastery, though. You become a sage. It's sageness, but sage without the wisdom. It has to do with, we're talking about play, anger, and rage. This kind of like can have trickster energy to it. I call it Wu Wei. It's not perfect, but it has all that flavor to it. But I think it's the excellence in that that affect stream. It comes along with it. That's where the energy signature comes from. So this is just a psychotechnology that you can work across all levels of all individuals. Where are we working with? Where's the potential for movement in this direction? Also to notice when it's very similar to the Dzogchen notion of Buddha bodies. So for example, when I said earlier, if you notice you have a certain energy signature, you might be someone more in the mastery stream or more in the seeking stream or more in the connection stream. You tend then to become a spiritual adept in that area, right? So you become a healer, for example, in the connection. You become a martial artist in the mastery stream, or you become a mystic in a more conventional sense in the seeking stream. So this shows the continuity all the way from animal nature to Buddha nature. The seamless continuity, it's a very interbeing, interpenetrative kind of model where you could then call, for example, and it's backed by science, reductive science and neuroscience. And well, that's a whole nother thing, to understand that the play of molecules and how molecules and your gut bacteria, the whole ecology of the biome and the physical molecules in you accord for all of this. It's not even about you. That and your experiences, obviously, with your early childhood, is your experiences in context of being a human. Now, I built it up from the bottom up. If I were in a spiritual community, I would present this from the top down, as they do, those transcendent types. Okay, I had to get it in there. So we have the basis, the path, and the goal. I think it's easy to see. Okay, so what I'm describing is my model. I teach it in my master's course. I teach it for coaching. It has elements of neuroscience, Jack Pansep, and then this woman, I think it's Diane Russell. She noticed that she was a student of Pansep, so she's noticed that they were similar. There's research on whether or not the contracted expanded thing has to do with vagal tone, which would be really cool. So it's a powerful thing. But now that I'm talking about this matrix, this is my work. This is a model I teach. Okay, so in the spiritual community, we have these three things: the basis, the path, and the goal. I think it's intuitive to see which is which. So the basis is the connection stream. This is the basis of all wisdom and liberation. The path is mastery, play. The basis is care, compassion is the word for it. The path is mastery, play. And the goal is to stand in the mystery, to be a perfect seeker. Curiosity, still hunting, seeking without an object, allowing, being in the seeking and allowing it all to manifest it for you, all the display. So with this simple but powerful source code, right? We're doing source code. I think it could be yeah, I think it's a very powerful approach. I think it there's an interesting thing where it doesn't work, where I find resistance, is that people want it to be more complex. They feel like it reduces their human experience. Those are people that are too much in the story or too conceptual. It's not conceptual enough. It's not complex enough. It doesn't have a lot of 12-syllabic Sanskrit words. You know, there's all this, there's many people who are not attracted. This is very similar to Shinzen Young's work, but I think Shinzen Young, you know, it's more based on, he doesn't have a lot of affect work. He has a lot more perceptual. We can look at perception later if we continue the series, but the affects are constantly, very complex dynamics. They're constantly priming the organism in subthreshold ways. Yeah, and then that can be moved into affective tone, then that moves into symbolism or story, and then you get the story builds up energy, and then you talk in your head. Yeah, the Enneagrams in this, I don't know. One of the you know, there's an invitation to play with this. One of the nice fun things about doing source code is that then you can map them onto other things and you find distinctions and contractions. At a certain point, I do a lot of what these are called heuristics in my course, and there's a certain type of person who's got high pattern recognition, cognition, and they try to map everything onto everything. You know, the way like when Wilbur came out, everybody mapped everything on, you know, I called it the a qualification of everything, you know. So it's more meant to be very useful tool in servicing yourself and being service to yourself and others and groups. You know, constantly try, they're placeholders for what some of you have learned the hard way to do energetically. So instinctively you have these ways of making these distinctions and discernments, but it's a really good plate, you know, it's offered as a placeholder to not only support that, but to accelerate your expertise or your ability to work at that leverage point.
Is there a name for this model?
Yeah, no, let's see, do I have a name for this model? Not really. I mean, it's a module in my course that I call the affective dimension of self. We do affect, we do perception, and we do spiritual wisdom. Yeah, so is there a balance point between expansion and contraction? That's really interesting. That's actually a technique. It's a valuable technique. You can experience yourself as holding that whole range. Like I'm both fearful and still curious at the same time. And what you do is you hold open until the body resolves that. You'll either be too afraid, the body made that decision, or you'll take the next step. So holding that balance point, if you feel you're right in between, you let the body, see the body, because the body is creating complex dynamics and it's not one or the other, and you can feel that you're somehow in between. So we work with the horses, for example, and sometimes like the stallion get really mad at someone. And there's this palpable sense like if one wrong move and you're fucked. And so you can feel, you try to release, like especially horses, you know, if you're more toward angry, you'll start to bunch up. And the horse will say, I know that game, that's a pow. So, but you don't want to sink away into nothing, and you just hold and hold. And there are that's a kind of yang energy. It's also true the mares will get very maresy with women who, if the women nag them, this is stereotypical, but the women nag them, they'll get, so they reach out and bop them, they want to bite them, and that makes the person angry, and they want more control, and then you just stay with that and you wait. And sometimes it takes 25, 30 minutes. The horse is holding on, body's holding on to it too. And you can't find an opening. You just stay and stay and stay until it's resolved. And it's a great exercise for this kind of work, because you know the horse does not hold a story. So that's what we say when you're caught in the liminal, in the in-between. It's kind of like being in a bardo state, and but you can count, in this case you can count on impermanence. It's not, can't stay there forever, so it's gonna come and go and take the time it takes. Sometimes what's interesting, when we do my course, we have people work in pairs, and we'll say describe experience, situation where you feel most caring, like that these energies, this caring energy is pouring out of you. Now, share with your partner what kind of thing makes you contract. What is it that makes you contract? And some people notice that they contract into panic, but they might contract into anger. And you start to see something very interesting about this, the way this thing's moving around. Some people go from care to anger instead of care to panic. So you can move, the contraction can move you into a different box. I mean, it's just a useful tool. But then you notice something about yourself. But usually if then you keep working this, people will notice they went from care to panic. They hold a story about panic, like they're ashamed of being a wuss, and they'll go to anger, right? So there's usually, if you watch and you're honest, they usually follow a little more closely that matrix. Yeah, so that's good, Sean. It's very close to what Daniel Schmattenberger calls generator functions, except the reason why I don't use that word is because I'm not saying there's an actual theory or causal relationship in here. To be very careful. So in my source code, it just means, I call them cognitive widgets. It just means there's a pattern there that's very useful to work with. Whereas Daniel does a lot of work on really finding causally the causal chain, right? So so that's why I don't call, it's very similar, but that's why it's a big difference. His work, a lot more sophisticated theory have in between all of those. Mine is more of a methodology. But very similar. If you read my paper, I put Schmattenberger's generative functions, Jordan Hall's deep code, and my source code all into the category called hacking that David Chandler writes about as a move toward releasing complexity. The paper is actually an appendix to the paper Why Metaphysics Matters. It's called The 6 Ways to Go Meta, and I think I have a podcast on it. But anyways, there are distinctions, but it's in that family of like, here's a complex realm, how do we make sense in complexity? We can look at all the generative functions, we can try to find deep patterns or source code, or we can have some kind of a methodology here. So that's how it works up. Are there any questions? We can have like 5 or 10 minutes if you have questions. I'm pretty much, that's the matrix, the affective matrix.
Bonnitta, something that's been coming up a lot recently in conversations I've been having with various different people is the importance of, and how badly we do in all sorts of ways, conflict resolution. And it occurs to me that this could be an incredibly useful model to bear in mind in the moment, because if conflict can be engaged in from a place of play and curiosity. I mean, I've heard you talk about this. I talk about it as friction produces forward motion. You, I think, talk about the clash of difference creating possibility, right? And so the managing of conflict, and this strikes me as, I mean, I'm only just thinking about it now because this is new to me, but it strikes me this could be an incredibly useful and simple map to have in that kind of domain, and recognizing in your interlocutor when they're falling into fear, when they're falling into anger, and the more people that become skilled at that kind of thing, it seems it resolves, well, not resolves, but makes a huge step towards making that easier.
Yeah, so you'll find that when you work with a model like this as the bones, you want it not to contradict any other technique. You want to say, oh, I see that in conflict resolution, I see that in nonviolent communication, I see that in this other something that someone else is doing. So it's not an alternative. It should say this can support the discernment in complex situations. So when I work with a client, I don't, well, when I teach this way, but if you're working with someone, you're just using this to track your own self. So you're not getting all lost in the weeds, right? But your language might be the discourse that you're already situated in. You know, you're going to have to use, you don't keep saying, oh, that's care, oh, that's care, you know. So yeah, but it's a methodology for, I mean, you can use it, you work it on yourself, you like it, but if you're in a normal discourse, it's a way to help you track and keep on track energetically. You know, how do you know if something's contracted? Well, you know, this is part of the work you have to do on yourself. You can feel, am I contracted or is the other person contracted? I worked with a client once and he said, oh, the boss is so awful. You know, he comes in and he yells at all the employees and the employees just take it. And he creates all this fear in his company. But the client said it in a way, I said, where does the sense of fear arise? And he realized it arose in him. Like he was working in a company where those kinds of like, fuck you, you know, whatever, all these kind of like play, very roughhouse play language was happening, and the contraction was happening in him, not in the employees. Right, so you have to be very careful. Yeah, so does lust, so maybe we need to do the next one on lust. Does lust move into the contracted state? Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of work done on the last one. We got my imagination going. Yeah, Sean.
I'm trying to relate this to last week's class. I had a sense last week that the feeling that stories should kind of be thrown away, that it was kind of this limiting thing. Obviously, like this week, it's more like our stories can modulate these feelings from like contracted states to healthier states. Like, how would you state that?
Yeah, so this is, I'm going to talk about it in different ways, answer your question. So this is a way to work underneath the story, right? So if I have a story, you know, and, but it's also where the stories arise from. And if you look at this model, you could get expanded, like play, roughhouse play, and this and that, and you could have a story that's kind of generating, you just keep more and more and more and more placeful because you like, oh, play, I'm going to master something. And you'll find that it can become pathological because the energy is being exacerbated by the story. And you're not really working toward mastery, you're just avoiding rage or something. The contraction is important. If I'm always playing and I never find a boundary, and that boundary feels like angry, I can't develop mastery. I can't distinguish it. This is when you're trained. I know I have a lot of animal examples, but they're very, it's cleaner examples. So when you train like these territorial dogs, you'll find one as a puppy, they're bigger and they're very enthusiastic and they're very playful. And every like play fight they're in, they win. Then you know you have to show that dog where a boundary is. Because without the boundary, they just become aggressive dogs. They'll just kill, you know, whatever. This is fun. I killed the rabbit. I killed this. I killed this little dog. I killed that. It's just, there's no boundary. A friend of mine actually thinks that the psychopathology in advanced teachers and gurus is exactly this, that they get beyond the boundary. They get beyond having another human being to surf boundaries. So it no longer creates mastery. It creates a kind of pathology. So it can look like narcissism where someone's out of control.
I think Jamie Will called that Luciferian.
Yeah, even God couldn't destroy Lucifer, right? There's a question why God needed Lucifer. blah, blah, blah. Okay, so the story can also be a positive, story too, not just like, a story that makes you contracted. The question is, can I live with a body whose rhythms are adequate to the reality that I am in, and not impute stories on them, not have them follow tracks of stories that are either sad or happy or, yeah. So now stories can be helpful in little amounts, but people, we really don't understand. These little playgrounds aren't sophisticated or long enough, but we really don't understand how much we are storied people. So, for example, there's this notion of ellipsis in movie making. Does anybody know that? And ellipsis is like, you'll be watching a sitcom and the two women will be like, oh, I'm so nervous, I'm going out on this date tonight, and blah, blah, blah. And, you have a conversation. And then the next, 2 seconds later, you see they're on the couch again and one's got like an ice bag on her head. And you fill in the whole central story is this date, and it's not in the TV, it's not in the sitcom. You fill it in yourself, right? And so this is what happens to us all the time. There's very little going on. There's very little perceptual information going on in many cases, and you just like, you've just put all this stuff on. And so when you live in this story, you fuck up your affect system and you literally cannot see reality. And when you can see reality, it's fucking beautiful. And you miss all that all the time. So someone interestingly asked about Christopher Alexander. Where did that come from? Because I was going to start today by reading a passage from The Timeless Way of Building. So there's some kind of like, who asked the Christopher Alexander question? Yeah, so why don't we just end with the thing that I was going to begin with. I don't know when this happened, but there's some magic in this space. Okay. So this is in the chapter called Being Alive. And the title of this little section is This Wild Freedom. This passion comes into our lives in the instant we let go. It is when all our forces can move freely in us. In nature, this quality is almost automatic because there are no images to interfere with natural processes of making things. But in all our creations, the possibility occurs that images can interfere with the natural, necessary orders of things. And most of all, this way that images distort the things we make is familiar in ourselves. For we ourselves are, like our words, the products of our own creation. And we are only free and have that quality without a name when we give up the images which guide our lives. Yet each of us faces the fear of letting go, the fear of being just exactly what one is, of letting the forces flow freely, of letting the configuration of one's person adjust truly to these forces. Our letting go is stifled all the time, so long as we have ideas and opinions about ourselves which make us hug too tightly to our images of how we live and bottle up these forces. And yet, until one does let go, it is impossible to be alive. And in this case, the forces in it are these affect streams, these primary intentional motivational states. Okay, thank you for being part of this experiment at the STOA. The STOA is run by a gift economy. Your presence here is already a gift. But if you feel like you'd like to contribute more, there's a way to do that somewhere on the website. Google will be happy to take you there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnitta. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome.